Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we have the most common mistypes for the ISFP personality type. So the types that ISFPs tend to think that they're the most often when they don't know their ISFP is either INFP or INFJ. And so typically when ISFPs take online tests, I've seen them get results ranging from INFP being the most common. So when they take a random online test, INFP is the most common type that ISFPs get on these online indicators. And when they learn about the functions, they realize that they use NI and SE. And so then they end up typing themselves as INFJ. And so that typically is the most common journey. The range of types I've seen them mistype the most as is INFP, INFJ, sometimes even INTJ on occasion. I see a few of them getting ISFJ. So it's almost there, but it's like that one letter difference makes all their cognitive functions different. And so I noticed that sometimes when ISFPs are in work mode, they sometimes score out J results on tests. And it's because your stage in life can influence how you fill out tests. And so sometimes you'll have ISFPs scoring J when they, so those are common things to look out for if you give a friend a test and you notice that they might be mistyped. Those are the most common trends you'll see for the ISFP personality type. But there are loads other mistypes as well. Those are just the most common. So that all being said, we're here to talk about the most common mistypes for the ISFP personality today. And so Kurt, would you like to tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, hi, my name's Kurt. Obviously ISFP, and I have gone through Personality Hackers profiler training, so that was really cool. And yeah, I agree with Joyce. I definitely, years ago when I started taking those online tests, I would get INFP mostly, and then I became pretty good friends with an INFP. And it became pretty clear that there were some major differences between us. And so then I started looking into why that might be. And then I thought it was INFJ. So just as Joyce described, and I related a lot to like the descriptions of NI and also FE, to be honest. And it wasn't until I went through the personality hacker training and looking at some other systems as well helped me to understand the cognitive functions and settle on ISFP. So yeah.
I'm glad you found your type home. I believe you were typed on stage with Joel and Antonia, and then they typed you as ISFP at a Personality Hacker live event. We're both classmates at Personality Hacker, and yeah, we do some profiler trainer stuff there too. And so Adrian?
My name's Adrian. I was typed by Joyce as an ISFP, and I used to think I was an INTJ for a long time. I just really highly identified with my NI, so I mistakenly thought it was a lot higher than it was, but I can very clearly see that it's not the top function for me. But yeah, that's me. I don't know. I'm 22. I'm kind of just working right now, Yeah, that's me.
Really awesome, Adrian. Some SFPs will mistype as NTJ sometimes. That was the case with Adrian, but I noticed it with some other people I see in the community as well. They'll start off thinking they're INTJ or ENTJ when they're really an SFP type, so an ISFP or an ESFP. And so, Julien?
Hello, I'm Julien. I have been in the personality community per se for maybe 5 years now. I started just with MBTI, online quizzes, memes, YouTube, talking with friends. I got a book called Speed Reading that I think is more like, I can't remember what the term is, more like temperaments and things like that. And that being said, when I was doing tests a long time ago, I would get INFP pretty consistently. And when I first got into Myers-Briggs, I met a friend in India, and he's kind of the guy who got me into this all. And he typed me as an INFP, but actually at first he was unsure, like ISFP, INFP. But the problem is with a lot of people typing, and what he was doing was he was using a lot of anecdotes. He was looking at what I was wearing mostly and like what I was interested in. And those aren't necessarily the best indicators for what a person's type are. But I would type as an INFP for years. And on all the tests, I might get like ENFP once in a while if I was feeling like, actually I do like hanging out with people, and I answer that question on a test. And and so, I mean, like the tests are all pretty flawed, but regardless, I got into objective personality, and I was typed by Dave and Shan there as an ISFP, but not necessarily a traditional ISFP, an ISFP jumper, they call it. So someone who has FI and NI as the lead functions, and who kind of like skips over SE. And that resonated with me more than INFP because of the NI part. The functions are all very unique with what they do, and how they interact with the other functions, right? And so I see these perceiving functions as kind of like funnels. They're what we use to perceive the world, and they funnel in information outside. And so any might be funneling in patterns and abstractions, and what they're narrowing down is kind of like personalized facts. And so for SE and NI, they're more funneling in facts and experiences, and then narrowing that down into personalized patterns that affect their own life. And so it made more sense, I guess, in that regard for myself. I mean, I also just like SE things in general, like anecdotes, music. I like dancing. I like all these things that you mostly correspond with SE, and not so much like randomly looking at new information or pursuing various different courses. Like we all do that once in a while. Like we all do everything, but for the most part, I'm not really interested in all these new ideas and concepts. It's just kind of like, give me the one concept, that's great, and then mostly experiences. I want to go out there and experience things. And so, I mean, what else? I'm 28 years old and I work in a factory, which is pretty great. I don't know if there's anything else left to say. Thanks.
Cool. So I find ISFPs most commonly, other people will type them as INFP. So they'll go like, I can see your FI and you seem intuitive. But ISFPs are one of the most intuitive sensing types as well. And so oftentimes they'll type themselves on the intuitive side. It's just like there's a huge test taking bias where people score IN a lot of the time. So whether it's INTJ, INFP, INFJ, INTP, everyone scores into that little category, I notice, on online tests. And so it's easier to mistype if you mistype as one of those 4 types there, because all online tests skew towards those 4 types. And so, Monique, would you like to tell us a bit about you?
Sure. So I'm Monique. I originally started getting into personality typing like maybe 2.5 years ago. So when I first took the test, my sister was doing it, and she's an ESTJ. And so when I took the test, it was from the book, Please Understand Me. And I think I typed as an ISFJ. But when I read the description, I was like, this doesn't sound like me. It felt too traditional in a way. And so when I took the test again, I think I took 16 personalities and I typed as an INFJ. And then I read that and I was like, that sounds too abstract for me. And so I took it again, and I think I was split between the T and F. So I read the descriptions for ISTP and I read the description for an ISFP, and I felt more comfortable with the ISFP description. Especially when it came to like SE, because I'm really into hands-on things and in my environment, especially like just doing activities like Julien was talking about, more experiences. I'm more interested in that than anything else. So I felt like abstract concepts are interesting to me, but I don't naturally gravitate toward them first. I'm more into what is practical, what can I use, what is going to help me or my environment right now. So that just seemed more like an ISFP. Although I don't necessarily relate to how they call us the artist. Like, I do like doing those kinds of things, artistic type of activities. But like just sitting around drawing or painting and stuff, I'm like, I don't really do that. I used to be a poet. I used to do all those things. But now I feel like my interests have changed. So just in everyday life, you won't see me doing those kind of things.
Yeah, that's rad, Monique. Like we were saying earlier, tests have a dichotomy bias towards the INFJ dichotomies. So that's why Monique would score J on all of the tests, because you're more likely to score all of those 4 dichotomies in a test. And so please understand me. It's really cool how you mentioned that, Monique. So there's a lot of ways to figure out your true type. One of the ways is going through a typing service like Julien or Kurt or Adrian and having someone give you another take of your type. And then you realizing, oh, I might actually be that type that the typing service got me as. That's one way to find your true type. One of the other routes is Monique, she read Please Understand Me, and she was able to narrow down her best fit type by reading the 16 descriptions that Kiersey had in that book. And so there are a lot of correct, valid ways of getting to your true type. And so the lesson from here is to not trust tests. Tests are wrong a lot of the time. Even if it's like a smidge wrong, INFP and ISFP is a less of a typing error than a lot of test typing error, but it's still an error. So take it with a grain of salt and try to double check your type through different sources and through different things. It's really great to kind of look at different systems as well and to see how you fit there, because they might provide you something that you never considered, and that might help you find your true type too. So what I'm saying is there's a plethora of ways in which you can go about really finding the type that fits you the most. Another method in which to figure out your type is to not be so attached to your type. Sometimes people will find a type and they'll go like, this is my type, I love it so much, and now it's my identity. And when it becomes too hard to let go of that type, it's easier to mistype yourself.
I have a question. There is a girl who I originally, when I was doing my investigation on INFJs, and I was like, this doesn't sound like me. And I kept watching her videos. Then it was like other people started talking about her not being an INFJ. And I just kind of wondered, was that like a running theme as well, that you have so many INFJs on YouTube and people start attaching themselves to the description and that person? They're like, oh, well, we have so many things in common. But it's like, but she may not even be an INFJ.
Yeah. Yeah, the 2 most mistyped types of all time are INFJ and INTJ. And NIDOMs. Everyone wants to be an NIDOM.
How come it's so like, and it's made to look so good, like the NI leads, the INTJ, the INFJ, like how come it's so attractive? Is it because it's claimed as the rarest on 16 personalities, which is impossible? They couldn't possibly know what the rarest type is in the world. Or is it just like they've inflated these definitions to make it seem like this is like a master function that is just like better than the other functions? Like what's up with that?
It gets tricky there because FI likes to be special too. So I think FI is the function most likely to enjoy being 1% of the population, or to go like, yeah, I feel a unique sense of identity in my FI because of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny you say that, because when I was watching videos and just listening to people's experiences and reading the book, I was like, I don't feel this way. Like, honest, from my personal experience, I felt like my experience is unique to me, but I didn't feel the need to always stand out and be different. So it's interesting that that FI with that wanting to be special, I'm like, I don't really want to be special. I think I just want to be authentic. And I want to be recognized for being authentic, if that makes sense. Like, just know that I'm genuine. I don't have to be special, just genuine.
I think that's more balanced, honestly, because from my upbringing, I really wanted to be special. I was born with a twin, not an identical twin, but like a fraternal twin. And throughout my entire life, I wanted to be differentiated. I wanted to be special. I wanted to be unique in a way that was individualistic from that. And I can see that it wasn't really a healthy trait to have per se, because if you want to be like this very special type of character, then most of the time you're not going to really fit in anywhere, and you're going to detach yourself from various tribes and communities. Because if you're always trying to be unique in a way that doesn't align with other people, that you're going to be pushing them away, and so you end up alone. And it's just like not this nice feeling to have. But I think it comes from like insecurity about your own value individually in yourself, and you think maybe that you don't have, like, you might not have value intrinsically inside yourself, and so you're always trying to search for some way that you have intrinsic value just on your own, and you end up alienating yourself because it's not really that important.
Yeah, I could see that. On the same topic of value, so my sister got me to read this other book, and it's about Enneagrams. And I forget the name of the book, but that was one thing, because I thought I was an Enneagram 4. And that was one thing it kept talking about over and over and over, is about being value, especially if you're unhealthy. I think it emphasized that more so. But I could see that being the case. Like, if you place so much emphasis on being valuable to the outside world, sometimes you kind of put everyone else, like, distance between you and the outside world. If you don't feel like you're being appreciated, I guess, if that's the right word.
That is a really good point. A lot of INFJ descriptions will talk about how they feel different than other people. But oftentimes, a lot of IP types feel different from the group or from the people around them. With some IPs, you'll hear them saying they don't feel like they're everyone's cup of tea. Because when you live your life authentically, or you try to be genuine to who you are, oftentimes that will conflict with group interests. And so oftentimes that'll make you feel different than the people around you. And so just generally being an IP can get confused for these INFJ descriptions that you'll read online too. So beware of that. Because there are a lot of different ways in which someone can feel misunderstood. And it doesn't have to be because you're the rarest personality type.
I just wanted to go back to what Julien said about like NI being kind of like hailed as like some like great function or whatever, and I feel like it's just really painted as like, you know, like super mysterious and like, whoa, like, wow, I'm so cool, like how does NI work, you know, like everyone's like, you know, we don't really know or whatever, and it's like this mysterious thing. And so I think that's why it's like people want to identify with it, because it's like, I don't know, it's like this otherworldly thing that people paint it out to be, you know what I mean?
Definitely. You remind me too, when I first got into MBTI, my friends would like paint this picture that NI was almost like prescient, like it was future seen, like it somehow was able to look through into the future and make these correct assumptions. I mean, if that's what you do all day, make assumptions about the future, you're going to be correct 1 out of 100 times, but that doesn't mean 99 of the other times aren't going to be incorrect, right? But, you know, we ignore those parts.
Fascinating. And so I was thinking for our first topic, we could talk about the differences between INFP and ISFP. So if you were going between these two types, how would you tell apart them? What was your experience with, if you were to ever think you were an INFP, how would you differentiate that from being an ISFP?
So I think the first thing, it's like a lot of ISFPs are pretty in tune with their NI, and certain systems like objective personality that Julien was talking about, they kind of recognize that and they have that built into their framework. So like you could be a jumper. So I think if you have any connection to like your intuitive function, which a lot of us do, then and especially if you're approaching MBTI as a newcomer, then it doesn't really make sense to you that you would be a sensor instead of an intuitive. I think there's also probably a disproportionate number of intuitives who are interested in typology. I mean, that's maybe a bit of an assumption on my part, but I think it seems like I know a lot more intuitives types that are interested in it. And so there's a little bit of a bias that, being intuitive in general is more of a cool, outsider, unique thing, not just with NI. So I think that's one reason why so many people would identify as INFP and also test as INFP, because maybe the perceiving side of you comes through enough in the test, but your intuitive side also comes through. And so I think, I mentioned earlier that I had a good friend who was an INFP, and I was able to see a lot of differences between us. And that mostly comes down to the perceiving functions being different. But I think there's also differences like in the way that your FI will show up, in my opinion. So definitely the intuitive functions, I guess you could compare, like people that have NE, auxiliary NE, instead of SE, they're more interested in they're more attuned to having an unbiased view toward new concepts and new ideas. And one of the ways you would see that show up is like in a brainstorming session. I think people hear the word brainstorming and they think like creativity, and everyone's like, oh, I'm definitely creative. But it's like, I guess if you kind of look and try and pay attention to be able to compare yourself with other people, like in that type of a setting, particularly, like I found myself having difficulty coming up with like brand new ideas or as creative ideas as some of people that I've encountered who have NE. So I guess that would be one way. And that's a little bit of like a humbling thing if you like want to view yourself as creative. But we all do have a creative side. It's just different. Like I think with SE, your creativity is more geared toward like the concrete things. Whereas with NE, the creativity is more with ideas and concepts. And if that makes sense.
Well said, Kurt. And so you'll find with extroverted intuition, it loves variety within ideas. And so with an INFP, they'll sometimes take ideas to an extreme. Like they don't like ideas that are always being told and said. Like they kind of want to explore new idea territory. They're going to want new ideas. And so they're going to sometimes entertain these really interesting ideas where you're like, wow, you just bounced off a really interesting idea. And it's quirky. INFPs will want to be more experimental with their ideas because they're less personal. And so they're going to want variety there. But an INFP will want sameness with the sensory. So with introverted sensing, they're going to want more of like consistency there, more stability there, more predictability there. And so you'll see this interestingness where an INFP will enjoy these quirky idea explorations. And they'll be good at like just throwing out ideas that you'll be like, whoa, where did that come from? Because they're not attached to them. So that's something you'll notice that's a little different. INFPs sometimes will be a little more verbose in a more talkative way with ideas because they come in plentiful ways with the NE. The NE will be more generative of ideas, like generating ideas, as Kurt was saying, through ideating or brainstorming more often. And oftentimes with NE, when you generate a plethora of ideas, these ideas might be competing with one another too. So one idea you have might be a little different than this other idea, which might actually undermine your initial idea. But with NE, that's okay because it's the exploration that's energizing, and it's through the bouncing off and talking it out with someone else that you crystallize it. So there's a bit of chaos, like chaoticness, when they use their idea generating function. When they're entertaining different concepts, it's actually very chaotic with an INFP. Whereas with ISFPs, they're not as chaotic when they're presenting new ideas or concepts. So with an ISFP, when they present concepts, it's actually more personal and it's going to be more well thought out before they say it. So an ISFP is going to actually think through the concept a little bit before kind of telling it to you. It's going to have a little bit more of, all right, I thought this one idea through and how it plays across time. So it's going to be more about this idea, this one idea, like what Julien was talking about, and fleshing out this one idea with ISFPs. So they're going to stay with ideas a little longer, and their ideas are going to be a little bit more fleshed out, and they're not going to. And it's almost like with NI, an idea kind of has to be refined in your head first, organized in your head first, before you actually say it out loud. So there's also that as well. There's less bouncing off to figure out ideas than an INFP would do. And so it seems a little less chaotic. And sometimes it'll cause an ISFP to talk less unless they actually have something they want to say that has been truly like thought out in terms of ideas. And so ISFPs on a whole are a little less talkative than INFPs are. Doesn't hold true all the way, but it's a cue for some of them.
Yeah, as you were sharing that, I got this like mental picture of someone like playing in a sandbox, and that's kind of like NE, and it's just like that's their element of to just explore, do whatever. But then like NI is more like you want to build up this like perfect, beautiful sandcastle first before you present it to the world. And I think that's another good differentiation to know, like if you have NI, because it's like in my experience with INFPs, they don't have that same like future oriented, well, let me make sure this idea is going to work in the future. Whereas NE is just like in the present moment to just explore the idea without having any conditions attached, without having like any, is this going to work or not, kind of a thing. So
Yeah. With NI, you'll see, let me take this idea and then project it into the future. So see how the timeline almost of that idea and the linear projection of that idea because of the SE. The SE has more of a wanting to see how this one idea plays out in multiple sensory scenarios and what is the main pattern or the main pattern from that sensory, all of those sensory scenarios, almost the root, the essence of it.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add, it doesn't mean like that people with NE don't think about the future. I think you can certainly have ideas about the future, but it's like the trajectory. They don't like think about that part. They just think about like the future more broadly, or an idea in the future or something like that.
I was going to say too, I have a cousin I think is an INFP. And oddly enough, so you said that about not always being the case. She doesn't talk nearly as much. But I also feel like we're both in the nursing field. And so we were both debating about continuing our education and going back to school. And so once I started doing the research, I was like, if I'm doing the research, I'm going to make this happen. Like, I don't even start researching or looking into things that I'm not going to make a reality for myself. And I think she's not like that. Like, she'll do all this research and then see like, oh yeah, maybe if I get upset, like not upset enough, but like bothered enough, then I'll do it. But I think she's a lot more comfortable being stagnant in her position. Whereas I'm like, no, once I made my mind up that I'm not staying here, like I've got to go. So once I did all my research and like started doing, looking at schools that I could possibly go to, it was like, okay, I'm doing it. I'm putting my application in, I'm going. So I'm like, I think in that regard, I'm a lot more likely to carry things through in a practical sense. Whereas I think she's more comfortable playing with the idea of things, but not necessarily making it happen. And I'm not. I just feel like I don't know, for me, it's a waste of time to talk about something if I'm not going to do it. I'm like, why? I don't even want to go down that road if it's not going to happen.
Yeah. It's way more likely for extroverted intuition to research many topics of interest that they will never really do. So it's like, oh, it's just nice to NE learn about these things and absorb these different ideas from these different disciplines, but not necessarily have an application with them sometimes. That also speaks for the polar SE that INFPs have. So sometimes they can stall real world application of things. You're laughing, Kurt. Why are you laughing?
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with that because I had that very same experience as Monique with my INFP friend. And I noticed that this person would, I would say, phrase it that he would give himself permission to like abandon an idea even. Like it might have been something that he gathered people together behind this great idea, because I think INFPs can have like a very visionary side to them, some of them, and would be so passionate about this idea and gather people up to like kind of get behind and like, let's move toward this thing, but then would be okay also abandoning it. And I feel like personally as an ISFP, like there's something where you because you're looking toward the future and the trajectory of things, you don't want to have to go through that. You don't want to put effort into something that might be abandoned. Just kind of exactly what Monique said. So I just wanted to say I agree with that.
Yeah. And so, Adrian, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
I was just gonna say, like, with the NI thing, like I'll only like delve into stuff like very thoroughly if I know like it's gonna, like apply to me, or like I'm not even gonna lie, like I don't look into like every single type and like delve as much into it as much as I would my own type, so I would say just like, yeah, anything like researching or anything like that, I can totally relate to that.
Cool. And so, Julien, any thoughts on this topic?
I mean, it's tricky to add on when so much has been said so well already by yourself and Kurt, Monique, and Adrian. But I guess if I could add anywhere, it would just be to go back to this idea of the introverted intuition versus the extroverted intuition, and the idea of introverted functions being more personal than the extroverted functions. And so you already spoke on this a bit, Joyce, about how the INFPs are not as personal with their ideas. They'll throw them out there and it's just kind of like they're having fun. And Kurt said with the sandbox, they're playing around. It's not personal. It's just ideas are being thrown around. Do with them as you will. No problem, not personally attached to it. But for the ISFP, the beliefs and the ideas are a lot more personal, and there can be a lot more pain per se if you do present an idea and it's treated as something impersonal by somebody who has any, when to you it's actually really personal, and that can cause a division, and they don't even realize it. You might not even realize it. But I've definitely avoided talking about certain things that interest me or that I care about a lot, because I have this sense that is very personal to me, and I don't want it to be treated as something impersonal or torn down by somebody else, because to me this is like a part of who I am. It's a personalized idea, kind of like personality theory. I think, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think a lot of ISFPs might not generally talk about personality theory with random people that they meet, like acquaintances or friends that aren't that close, because it's personal. It's something that they believe in, that it's part of their identity, and it's threatening if that can be messed around with by somebody else, and maybe the NE dominance would have an easier time just throwing like, oh, I just looked at this MBTI thing, this objective personality thing, like there's this and that, like let's play around. Ooh, maybe this idea, maybe that idea. And that doesn't really matter though, whatever. Well, for us, for myself, it's kind of like, you sure you want to hear about this? Because like, if you say anything mean to me, I will never talk to you again. I'm just kidding. Like that's not real. That's an exaggeration. But it's this difference between personal and impersonal, and it can get really heated really quickly, and it's uncomfortable for ISFPs versus what I imagine an INFP would go through. So that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, I totally relate to you, Julien, on that. Like if I know, like my sister is like so skeptical of like personality theory and anything like that. just because she's like had to do like tests at work and stuff like that, and it's never really translated. And like they'll tell her like they can't hire someone or like do certain things because of like tests that they'll have people do, or like they'll say like people won't perform a certain way but then they will. And so she's just like so skeptical of it, and like she'll like tear me down on it, and I'm like, okay, like i'm not I'm not like super gonna talk to you about it because I know you're like how your perspective is fixed on it, and like to me it is kind of personal. So yeah, I totally relate to that.
That's a good point, Julien. And because NI is a personal function for the ISFP, it might make them really even more to their intuition, because I think people feel the most connected to their introverted functions. So if your intuition is introverted, it actually might make you even more identify with intuition, because the more real side of you feels intuitive almost. It's like the extroverted functions are less personal and less us, and the introverted functions are more us. And so oftentimes you'll find people sometimes relating a little bit too much to their introverted functions. So you'll find that there are some TJ types who think that they're F types because I have FI, and so my FI feels so strong, and so I must be a feeling type. And so it's interesting with some of them there. Like I had someone on my channel, her name was Gray from Augmented Personality, and she thought she was an FP when she was really a TJ, because she's like, yeah, that FI though, I feel it, it's there. So sometimes our introverted functions feel stronger than they actually are sometimes with some people, just because they're personal, and so you'll identify with them more. And Kurt's always laughing to himself.
I'm sorry. I kind of like only caught a glimpse. Was that a cat that walked by? It looked like this cat like put his tail in your face and you like swatted it away. I'm sorry, it just made me laugh. I don't know if that actually happened or not.
I think I was about to sneeze, so I was like, just stay away from my nose area, just the nose. Because it's like when you watch those comedy shows and they like tickle. I don't know, I just really didn't want my nose tickled. Oh gosh. Yeah, that's FI self-amusement right there. Cool beans, everyone. And so the next type we will tackle is ISFP versus INFJ. So ISFPs, if you ever thought you were an INFJ, or if you could imagine how it would be like if you thought you were an INFJ, why did you believe that? And how would you be able to tell the difference between INFJ and ISFP?
Yeah, I think for me, when I realized that I wasn't like my friend who was an INFP, and I started looking into the difference between INFJ and INFP, I came across a bunch of different articles, and I related so much to the INFJ descriptions. And so I was one of those people who was like very attached to like this idea that I'm an INFJ. I think it mostly had to do with the way that they were really talking about NI. I feel like there's not really like any other medium that I'm aware of or that I've encountered that even kind of describes NI. And so it's like the first time that I was seeing this like description of something that felt like such a big part of me, especially one that wasn't necessarily in like a spiritual context or like a, because like the ideas of like people being a psychic or having, some kind of spiritual insight into the world or other people, that exists obviously, but like for it to be like, no, this is actually a part of some people's personality, that was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And it was very, I don't know, just affirming, I guess, of that part of who I am. So I got really attached to those descriptions. And I also feel like there's somewhat of a, I don't want to say a bias, but like there's this idea that only people with FE like are aware of other people's emotions or can like relate to other people's emotions. But I think it's just a misunderstanding, I think, because I definitely feel like very aware of other people's emotions and easily able to identify what they're feeling, sometimes even before they do. And I think it's like this combination of FI and NI that sort of allows you to do that. So yeah, for me, I guess the deciding factor was really learning the cognitive functions, especially FI. And I think surprisingly, FI actually took me a long time to understand, because as a dominant function, you're kind of, it's so subconscious that you don't really have an awareness of it. You know, the ability that I naturally have to be in tune with my emotions was so like automatic, is kind of what I'm trying to say, that I wasn't aware that I was constantly pinging my own emotions. How do I feel about this? You know, every new person I encounter, every new color I see, just like all the time, you're reading your own emotional reaction, and that sort of like provides this compass as you go throughout your day. So yeah, I hope that all made sense.
Yeah, with the judging functions, they're metricizing things and calibrating things. And so like Kurt talks about how like it's on a subconscious level, you don't really even know it, but you have this idea of how things are making you feel. And it's like you kind of assume when you go through that everyone else does that too. And so you don't realize that you're using FI because you use it all the time. And so it's like, wait, other human beings don't do that all the time. There's also an element of harmony that FI is looking for too. It just looks for like an internal sense of harmony. So let's say you're having an emotional reaction towards something and it is negative. To get back into internal harmony, to find alignment within your FI, there's going to be this urge to maybe TE do something about it, but it's the last function of the ISFP. So it might come out in like very sharp spurts or just repressed spurts. And so, yeah, FI is looking for alignment within its own feelings with reality itself sometimes. And so, Monique?
So when I was reading the description, one thing for me that stood out was along the lines of feelings, in that you absorb the feelings of other people. And that was one thing that did not resonate with me. I think you had a type session recently. You were talking about how we pick and choose what we want to emotionally attach ourselves to or relate to, but we were able to cut it off. And I felt like I felt that more frequently, in that I always know how I'm feeling about something. I'm also aware of how other people may be feeling in the room. Like I can walk into a room and feel people's emotions, but I don't allow their emotions to overcome my emotional experience in that moment. But I'm also a lot more aware of how to regulate my own emotions. Like you were talking about, how do you relate how you're feeling to reality? And so sometimes I'll be like, okay, Monique, like maybe this isn't the appropriate time to feel like this. Worry about it later. Or maybe I'm being too emotionally responsive to the situation and it's not appropriate and I need to stop feeling like this right now. And if it's too overwhelming, then I'll just exit the environment. But I always am aware of how I'm feeling, and I'm always registering that first before I do anything. Like, how do I really feel about this? Am I going to feel like this tomorrow? And it seemed like in reading INFJs, that was missing, and that something will happen, everything seems fine, and then later on they'll be like, oh, actually, I didn't like how that person said this or did this, and it doesn't register. And so I was like, I don't feel that way at all. I'm always really aware of how I'm feeling and how it's affecting me. And then even with FI and feeling for other people and their circumstances, I do feel deeper if I've gone through it, or if I can literally see myself in that person's shoes. Like, oh, if they were to lose a relative, let me put myself in their position. How would I feel if that was happening? And then I'll emotionally respond in that way. So it seems like with INFJs, they're better able to pull themselves away, like objectively from a situation, at least in the moment. I don't know about later on, but it seemed like the INFJ that I know, I don't feel like there's an emotional reaction initially. And even she has said that before, like that she doesn't feel that. So that's kind of what I'm relating it to. And then reading the description also seemed that way.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense, Monique. And so a good differentiator between Fi and Fe is, do you have a synchronous reaction to something, or is the asynchronous reaction stronger? Fi is asynchronous in the sense that it feels within a vacuum of itself. It may be aware of what you're feeling and it cares about what you're feeling, but it's almost like how it comes to value judgments is within its actual own sphere rather than kind of referencing other people. It's more going to kind of reference that inner sphere. Even if it is considering other people, it's still within that vacuum. Like Ti and Fi operate within a vacuum, basically within a vacuum of itself. I don't know how to explain it. That's like the abstract illustration. Whereas with empathy and how it differs sometimes is, I've met Fi and Fe people who both identify as being empathic, but it is in different ways. So when I have Fi friends empathizing for me sometimes, like how Kurt was saying, like Fi is constantly having an emotional reaction to everything, whether or not you know it or not, or you're kind of like aware of your reaction to everything, even if you're not having a reaction. Like it's still like this awareness of reaction and how things can feel very visceral sometimes. And so I notice when I tell a story to Fi users, they'll latch on to specific things that I'll say. It's like not an even emotional response to all of it. It's almost like they'll have spikes of, wow, that really resonated with me, or that was really against me, or that was like, you can feel it as an Fi user is kind of, there's this asynchronous reaction they're having to you telling that story because they're comparing it to something within themselves. And you can feel it as an Fe person looking at Fi. Whereas like with Fe, it feels a little more blanket or general. Like the reason why like Fe is said to like absorb emotions, and an Fi person who's empathic might also relate to absorbing emotions, but they do it differently. So I find that Fe, when it absorbs emotions, it is not impressing its own emotional response to it. It's actually taking in your response as it's responding. So whatever you're feeling, Fe is taking a blank slate and is kind of like absorbing what you're actually feeling from a sponge standpoint. And so like whatever you're saying, if you're feeling that, like Fe is actually taking it in as it is without biasing it with its own reaction at all. So so both feel a lot, but they feel in different ways. Fe is way more present moment synchronous. And so it's going to be feeling while the situation's happening, and it's not imposing previous feelings onto that. I don't know how to explain it. Anyone's thoughts?
Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. I saw this video clip recently of Sharon Osbourne on, I think it was the X Factor. I'm forgetting which exactly show it was, but she was one of the judges on this talent show, and there was a singer who was very nervous. And in the critique portion, she was, in my opinion, using Fe, and she was describing, she was like, I feel nervous because you're nervous. And to me, that was like a perfect example of Fe, because, she was not the one being evaluated, but she was kind of, in a sense, sponging up, what he was feeling, and it made her feel very similar. Whereas I think somebody with Fi could certainly identify like, oh, wow, this person is feeling nervous, but that wouldn't make me feel nervous in that situation. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, Kurt. I will say things get a little more complicated when you combine temperament with this. So I think people from the NF temperament might relate to this type of empathy towards people, even if it's not your own situation, because it's a part of the NF temperament. So if you have those functions working together, like an intuitive function and a feeling function, strongly, you can also relate to things that look like Fe when it's really NF, if that makes any sense, with some NFs. I
did have a question.
Yeah.
How would you describe an I for you?
An I for a year?
For you. I just wonder with this. So I know that ISFPs also use NI, and then of course INFJs lead with NI or introverted intuition. And I'm just wondering, how does that present differently? Because in having a filter of Fi first, I don't like I feel NI and that I feel like I'm seeing patterns, but I think I'm also checking it against SE, and that I'm like, hey, I could be wrong though, because even though it seems like this is the case, I'm checking it against what's actually happening. And I just wonder if maybe that's another difference, if that makes sense.
That's a good point, Monique. So another way to tell apart these two functions is, are you toggling between NI and SE? So if you're an ISFP, you're naturally going to go between NI and SE in a seesaw fashion. Your middle two functions, you'll always be going through them interchangeably. Even if you have one you prefer more than the other, it's still easy to go between them. Whereas for an INFJ, it's easier for them to go between FE and TI, just toggle between them. And so that's a difference you'll see too. So how I experience introverted intuition, it's with future pacing. So it's almost like as an INFJ, sometimes I'll try to avoid extroverted sensing, spontaneity or chaos or unpredictability by future pacing. So it's almost like if I think about and imagine all the scenarios in which this could play out, then I can narrow down to the most likely scenario. And then I can then already have a response to it before it even happens. And so it's like I almost don't trust my ability to spontaneously act in the moment. And so I'll try to almost plan it out in my head so I don't even have to deal with spontaneity. And so there's that need for prediction. That's why, INFJs are kind of known for looking for the trajectory of things. Because the SE is painful. It interrupts your NI train of thought too. And so you want to minimize it as much as possible. There's a need to kind of predict beforehand with NI.
I think that's also a difference. I live for the spontaneity in the sense, like nothing crazy, but just like I like to be surprised. Like I like when things happen that I wasn't expecting. Like sometimes if I go into a scenario, for instance, and I know I'm going to be with the same people I've been with, like let's say we were all together today and I'm like, oh, this is kind of how the conversation went. It'll probably go like this tomorrow. But then if something happens in the conversation that changes or someone says something, I'm like, oh, I didn't expect that. Wow, that was a nice surprise. Like I like that on a small scale.
If you have extroverted sensing higher up, you're going to want a little more spontaneity than someone who has extroverted sensing last. And you might feel like it's pretty cool sometimes when things happen that are serendipitous but nice. Kurt talks about liking adventure sometimes. That adventurousness almost. Let me know if I'm misquoting you, Kurt, too.
No, that's true for me. I feel like I relate to both sides of the coin. Like I also have that part of me where I want to future pace and like be able to prepare myself. I notice for me, especially when it's like, if I think I'm going to be in a situation where I'm going to have to answer questions or something, I just kind of fall into that throughout my day or my week and in the coming time, and I'll play out these simulations of like, okay, well, how well do I really understand that concept so that I could be able to talk with people about it. And I just wanted to add, I think that's one of the reasons why an ISFP particularly could mistype as a J type, because a lot of the tests I noticed they have this like planning element to it, like, oh, only J's plan ahead for the future or whatever. But if you have that NI part of you that is like, maybe you do enjoy spontaneity more than an NI dom, but you still want like some level of preparedness. I think that plays a big part in why you could mistype as a J.
Yeah. There are a lot of behaviors you can have too that stem from anxiety or trauma that look like planning. When you've gone through something, like a situation has gone poorly because you haven't planned before, you're going to naturally be more of a planner too, because you want to prevent the negative thing from happening. And so, yeah, ISFPs can plan too. There is that part of them there. And so, Adrian, what are your thoughts, I guess, if you want to add?
So yeah, I definitely used to think I had SE last, but I think just realizing that, you know, I am a lot more spontaneous than I thought I was. Like, I would never have thought of myself in that way, but I mean, when I can, or like when I need to, like, I can really like fly by the seat of my pants and just like make things work. And you know, I used to not identify with SE because I I guess I was probably like a jumper. I don't know. I identified more with my NI, and so I never really considered SE being so high up for me. Um, but yeah, just because I was never like super in the moment type of person. But I mean, if it's that low, like your lowest function, I think it's a lot more apparent. So yeah.
Yeah. Cool stuff. And so one of the other ways you can tell apart an ISFP and an INFJ sometimes is through impulsiveness. So ISFPs are not as impulsive as SEDOMs. So with ESTPs and ESFPs, they are the most seemingly impulsive, but they might not see themselves that way. But as a friend of the SEDOM, you'll be able to tell that they're impulsive, but they might not describe themselves that way. One of the ways you can kind of tell apart SE auxiliary is also their level of impulsiveness too. Sometimes they're going to be more cautious than an SE Dom, so they won't be totally impulsive, but there might be like sides of them that have that impulsivity. Like Adrian sometimes goes on impulse purchases. Like little ways that impulsivity can show up, and that is indicative of a little bit higher up SE too. You notice someone just kind of doing that. Like with some ISFPs too, it's just vibe-wise, sometimes they're really chill. Like they sound like a stoner even if they're not a stoner. some of them. Not all of them, but when they do have that tone, they do have that tone. It's like a subtype of them have the chill, everything's gonna be all right voice. And that's also indicative of higher up SE too. Their flexibility, you can hear it in their voice. It goes down to that. But that's with some of them. But when it is there, it really is there.
Yeah, like with the flexibility, kind of like the power to really just adapt, or like if something goes wrong, you can just, you know, come up with another solution or something else in the moment that will work and you'll be fine. But yeah, I think there's that real like adaptability, like you were saying.
Cool. And Julien, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of worried that my Wi-Fi is cutting out, so I might get choppy here. But everything that needed to be said has been said already. I just wanted to add a couple things here. I guess starting off with spontaneity, it seems like with the NI DOMs versus SE auxiliary, it's like what we do more of is what we become better at and what we become more accustomed at. And so in my own experience, I've become pretty good at adaptability because I've just put myself into these situations almost accidentally, in which it's like, oh shit, like I have to wake up and solve this right now or else everything's screwed. And maybe the NI DOMs are not going to put themselves in that much of a situation because they're more considerate of, well, where's the possible dangers here, what might actually happen here. Well, like in my experience, it's kind of like, oh, I see, this is a good idea, and so I'm going to go do that, but I won't account for all the different difficulties that come my way. It's almost like an optimistic attachment to the spontaneity. For example, like I moved to New Zealand here 2 years ago, and I only planned on being here for 6 months or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll go to New Zealand. It'll be winter in Canada. It'll be summer over there. You know, I'll get a job, work for a while. And I got there, I'm like, wait a second, this is like way harder than I thought it'd be. Like, how do I get my bank account open? How do I get my tax code? How do I get a job? Like, where do I live? Like, what's happening here? And then the pandemic happened, and it's just like, I don't know for other SCs, but for myself personally, I was kind of like, this sucks, but I can work with this. Like this, like I've put myself in enough random chaotic situations that this chaos that's unavoidable from the world is something that I can manage now. And so that's like the build up of experience that leads us to be able to manage these things. And I sense I'm cutting out here. Hello?
We can hear you now.
My
Oh no, you can't hear us though. Oh, Julien.
I think it's a really good point about like the relativity of things. Is when you're trying to identify yourself, your type, you you might look at someone who's an SE Dom and say, oh, that's what sensors are, and I'm not that, so I must be an intuitive, or you kind of, underestimate what a type really is like, especially if you haven't seen them in your own life, like the whole example of like preparing ahead for the future. You might think, okay, well, I prepare for the future, but as an ISFP, if you compare yourself to like an INTJ, it's like vastly different of like how much they really do prepare for the future. I had like a couple different friends that are INTJ, and in conversations about like the pandemic and when it first kind of hit, and things like toilet paper went in short supply. I had SE Dom friends and even auxiliary who were like asking around if anyone had toilet paper, while the INTJs were like, I already had a shed full of toilet paper even before we heard about the pandemic. Like they were already prepared for an apocalypse or something. So I think it's just another thing to keep in mind. Like we just all have a tendency, I think, to try and define ourselves relative to other people and other types and other functions.
Yeah. And I think even if someone is impulsive, they wouldn't want to describe themselves that way too. So most people are kind of reluctant to take on that word in general because it has a lot of negative connotation. So sometimes it gets hard to see yourself accurately because of all of the seeing yourself relative to the people around you, and also words have connotations and how people see themselves differently than how someone seeing you from the outside sees you. So there's all of those factors. Self-reporting is questionable sometimes. Yeah, so excellent thoughts, everyone. And so I'm wondering how ISFPs contrast with INTJs. If you ISFPs ever thought you could be an INTJ, why do you think those reasons would be? And how would you know if you weren't an INTJ? What are the differentiator points for you?
I think why you would think you are is definitely identifying with your NI more. I definitely was that way when I used to think I was like an INTJ. And I think the biggest tell to know that you're not is, the higher TE. Like I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of lazy. Like, like I can force myself to do stuff, but like, like if I had higher TE, like I'm sure I'd be like a much more productive human being. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the biggest thing. Like you don't realize like the different like levels that like that you I can't even talk. But yeah, like each like slot has like a level, and you don't realize that you're not at that level, if that makes sense. Like I used to think I had like that parent TE, but it's very evident that I do not have that parent TE. And I think that's a pretty big tell. So yeah.
So one of the big tells is, can you force yourself to do something your heart's not into? The higher FI is, the harder it has a time doing things that doesn't resonate with its heart or how it feels. And so it's going to be more drudgery the higher up your FI is, that you have to do something your heart's not into. And also,
Can I quickly add to that point, just right now while it's present, is that some people might confuse that with like something that you don't want to do, and they're like, no, I can do that. I can do something that I don't want to do. But I think what Joyce is painting a clear picture here of is that it's more like, what do your values not align with? Because I know INTJs who are willing to do certain marketing tactics that would not align with maybe a lead FI's value system, and they'll go ahead and do it. And they're like, this is a great idea, though. It works so well. Like, the logic is clear. Like, it just works. Like, do it. And then you're like, but this doesn't align with my values of how to sell something. So I could never do that. And it's not like you don't like it or you don't want to. It's like, this is part of my value system and I can't do it like that. But it's like, I can clean the bathroom, even though I don't like to clean the bathroom, because somebody's got to clean the bathroom, right? It's a different thing. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to add that in.
Wonderfully said, Julien. And so one of the other ways to tell apart an INTJ and an ISFP is that sometimes when things are not authentic or not genuine, ISFPs notice it quicker. So it's like, that thing is really inorganic. So I hear words like, that's not organic. So you'll look at maybe a presentation of something and it's like, wow, this is so structured and systematized. It takes out the human of it and it feels a little icky. If you do something too TE efficiently, you take away the FI from it. And then it starts to feel a little wrong to do it that way. And so you'll notice that sometimes with FI DOMs too. They'll notice, wow, for instance, if you have a TJ asking an FP questions and they seem too structured because their TE is too strong, the FI person might think to themselves, wow, this is so unnatural. This is so inorganic. I have to answer this. It doesn't really feel like it's the natural sequence of how things should, like, I don't know how, it's not as natural as how it would feel comfortable answering.
I was actually thinking about in a small scale situation, but there was like a party that had to be planned. And so let's say that I was nominated to be on the party committee of like welcoming people. And for me, I was like, ugh, that doesn't feel organic. Like, I'm trying to like not be too specific just in case somebody's watching. But I was like, okay, I will do what you've asked me to do, but I'm going to find my way to do it. And so I made what they wanted me to make. And then I said, all right, somebody else can take over my role in the front lines and I'll be behind the scenes. And that's kind of how I met in the middle. I was like, this doesn't feel authentic for me. And you don't want me to be in the front because I'm going to be faking it. And I feel like you could tell I'm faking it. And so I just feel like a lot of times that tends to be what happens. I feel like INTJs are a lot better and able to cut off emotion or like personal attachment to something and just do it. Whereas if I'm like, this doesn't feel good for me or authentic to what I would actually do, and I feel like you're going to tell that I don't feel attached to this, and I'd rather, for the sake of everyone, not do this because I don't want it to be a thing. Like, if that makes any sense. I don't want to draw unnecessary attention to myself because I don't want to do this thing. I just rather do it a different way. And I think that's something I've noticed with INTJs. They're also a lot more strategic about going about getting things done. And I'm not like that. Like, okay, my husband's an ISTJ, and we were talking about this before, but when he does things with people, he's better able to be transactional with it. Even something as small as like, I'll see my neighbors outside and I will avoid them, not because I don't want to talk, but because if I'm going to talk to you, I kind of want to linger and like actually have a conversation, not just say hi, bye, and keep it moving. But he's better able to just be like, hey, and then keep moving, and he feels nothing. Whereas I'm like, no, I don't even want to talk to them. Let me run and hide so they can't even see me so that I don't feel bad for them. You know, it's just a weird thing, but that's kind of how I think of it. I'm like, I'm always trying to do what feels natural and not unnatural. So, yeah.
I was thinking of another difference, I think, between ISFP and INTJ is when it comes to like talking about your feelings. I think, I don't know if all ISFPs are this way, but I think I definitely have a tendency to maybe overshare because it's like, I'm processing this stuff all the time and it feels so natural and you kind of just assume everybody does it. And so I'll all, and there's also that whole like, oh, yeah, I want to be authentic. So I want to like, if someone asks me how I'm doing, I want to like analyze myself and I want to share, oh, I'm feeling all these different things. And it's like, whereas with INTJs, I think they also feel a lot because of their tertiary FI, but I think they're a lot more sensitive to opening that up to the world. They're a lot more typically guarded of that. And kind of reminds me of like earlier when we were talking about the tertiary NI of ISFPs and how it's like this part that is very sensitive, you know, and you don't always, you want to like kind of curate it before you present it, and you're a little bit more, I guess, guarded is the word. So I think that's another difference between the two.
Yeah. With INTJs, sometimes if they don't find a transactional reason for why they should share their FI with you, they just might not, because it's like, what's the reason to? It's not going to help further an end goal in the TE, so why am I going to tell you my FI? Whereas I don't think ISFPs are thinking about end goals oftentimes. And so, Adrian, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, yeah, I would say the reason that I used to think I had SE low was because of that SE, like, what do you say, like indulgence, I guess, you know? But I was like informed that, you know, anyone with SE can basically do that, but I was feeling like that was probably like my weakness or something. But yeah, I think just that kind of impulsivity, like Joyce said, that even like I definitely have, or even like the FI thing, because I remember I was telling Joyce when we're doing the profiling session, that like honestly for me, like it can be hard to hold down a job sometimes because like my heart won't be in it, or like even for me personally, like I would struggle with like depression, and it would just be like super hard to go through the motions, if that makes sense, you know? And like for something that I just didn't really care about. So I think that higher FI contrasted with the TE that that an INTJ would have, because they would just like kind of, you know, TE like force their way through the situation rather than, you know, trudge along, I guess, if need be. But yeah.
So you'll find with ISFPs, especially paired with Enneagram type 4, ISFPs will have more of an emotional oscillating emotional pattern. So maybe like they'll feel really good about this thing, but then maybe something will make them feel really bad about something else. There's just this emotional like ups and downs, which INTJs are less prone to than an ISFP that is an Enneagram 4. If they're an Enneagram 9, it gets more complicated. They might be more chill and not have those things, mood swings. But I find like FI DOMs have something that look like from an outsider, like a mood swing.
I get where you're coming from here. And personally, I feel comfortable talking to an FI, even if they're having a mood swing per se, because I have the foreknowledge using FI as well that they're taking responsibility for it. This isn't they're not making it my responsibility. They're not going to make it my responsibility. It's their responsibility. They're just sharing it so that it can be out there in the open or something like that. And so it's kind of like, okay, sweet. Like I acknowledge this. I see this for you. I will offer you my condolences, or whatever word works better. But I know that they're the ones that take response, and for that, it takes the weight off of myself. If somebody else is sharing their emotions like that, or having these mood swings going up and down, like they're really sad one day or they're really happy one day. It's like they come to you and you can see how they understand their emotions, and it's just like wow, man, like you understand it. Like it's difficult to see how there's a problem here, but I acknowledge it because I guess I'm using FI too. And I also have these swings that don't seem like swings personally, because it's kind of like I'm observing it all along the way. It's kind of like I can see as it's ramping up to a high almost, even if I'm not aware of the ramp up and I just notice the spike. It's like I can kind of work backwards and see how that ramped up. And then I can also see how that swung into a low. And I might not be noticing all the points along the way, But in retrospect, I can see like, oh, this is a natural process that's happening here with the emotions, and I can acknowledge that in someone else as well. But if it's another type, it might be foreign territory. Like if it is somebody who has FI lower in the stack, and I'm like, I don't know if this person is taking full responsibility of their emotions right here. And it's a lot scarier for me to try to manage the mood swings from somebody who has FI, but has it way lower in the stack. Because it's like, I don't think you really see your own emotions here or understand how they're manifesting right now. And that's a bit scarier. I think I lost track of what we're talking about, but anyway.
Yeah, that was well put, Julien. Really, really well put. And so here are some signs of FI. So with Kurt, sometimes he layers emotions. An example of this is like one day maybe you notice you're feeling angry and then you're having a reaction to how you're feeling angry. It's like, oh no, now I'm reacting to my angry feeling. And now I'm having a reaction off of my reaction to my angry feeling. So FI will sometimes do this layering of their own emotional reaction. It's meta reaction, a meta emotional reaction, which is really cool. Sometimes an identification of FI too is you'll notice like they'll say a statement and then at the end of their statement, they might say something like, and that made me feel like a bad person, or that made me feel guilty. So they'll have like a wisp of their emotion, but it won't be out front, but it will be like this emotional little sign. It's almost like they're reacting to themselves and they're just, sometimes it'll seep through, but it won't always show. So it's just like these little emotional reactions they have that may or may not sometimes come out in small ways. It's not going to be fully obvious. It's going to be like wisps. And so the next types I would like to contrast with you all is ISFP versus ISFJ. So if you're an ISFP, but you accidentally scored an ISFJ on a test, or you were entertaining it for a little bit, what are some tells to tell these two types apart?
I think since that was the first that I typed as, what threw me off is, this is going to sound really weird, but it felt like they have like a personal responsibility to everyone else above themselves, is kind of how I interpreted it. And maybe that's also FE in a way, and I'm maybe also adding in my personal experience with someone I know who's an ISFJ, who's a friend of mine. But I feel like I'm more comfortable verbalizing my wants and desires, and I know what they are, and I don't have to check in with anybody else. But that's kind of what I observed, that they're more likely to want feedback from everyone before they make a comfortable, solid decision on something. And then also, maybe it's also a stereotype, but just the routine, liking a lot of routine. It seemed to be that I didn't relate to that at all.
I think that even the TEs, like the INTJs, ENTJs, anybody with the TE high in the stack as well, can feel responsible for other people. It's like the FE and the TE are more outwardly focused with their doing and whatnot, and they're less connected to their identity functions. And so they're going to be looking at like, TE might be like, how can I solve other people's problems? While FE is like, how can I get everybody's emotions on the same page here so that we can come to some agreements or whatever? And so that's going to be a difference. But I mean, like ISFJ and ISFP is completely different functions, but I can see how people would score that in a test. Like I did the 16 personality test for fun the other day, and I scored an ISFJ, which I thought was like hilarious, because if you're feeling in a certain stage in your life where you're kind of like, you know, maybe I do value routine right now in this stage of my life, and you answer those questions that are really questions that just ask you like, how are you feeling right now about this idea? Like, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And you're like, I guess I agree with it, kind of, like right now, from my perspective. And then you might get ISFJ as a type when really it's just how you're feeling in that moment. And so I think what you really need to look at is like just how different all these functions are, like the SI and the TI being the personal identity-based functions versus FI and NI, which are more of the personal functions in the ISFP, right? And so SI will be more particular about things having their own like place. For example, like this item goes in this spot because that's where that item belongs, and there's a personal connection to these items and in this factual world or whatever. And I could be wrong about that. That's just what I've come to understand or learn about it. And then TI, which I can be corrected if I'm wrong with, is Joyce, but I have a brother, right? My twin brother, he's more like FE TI axis. And when it comes to logic, because I have the TE extroverted logic function, I don't get any kind of personal attachment to how something is done or the logic behind it. If it's an idea, it becomes personal. If it's a value, it's personal. If it's just logic, how something can get done, it's impersonal. You know, like tell me I'm doing it wrong and garbage, and it's like I might, if I feel like it's a personal attack to me as a person, then I'll feel offended. But if I think it's just about how I'm doing it, I'll be like, sweet, show me the better way of doing this. Show me the faster way of doing this. And like, for example, I was working in a greenhouse with a brother who's likely FE TI axis, and he was carrying like a large heavy object with someone else. And I thought it was like a dumb way of doing it. I'm like, that's a dumb way of doing it. Like, why are you doing like that? Like, why don't you do it some other way? And that was insensitive of me. But at the same time, it's because I don't connect anything personal with logic. It's kind of like, I'm not saying you're dumb. I'm just saying that way. Like anybody could do something a dumb way. It's just there's a better way of doing it. And if you hear something better, then you may as well adopt that. So it's impersonal. So Joyce, maybe you could correct me about how you feel about logic being personal or impersonal. But to me, I would kind of look at which functions are more personal that you identify with compared to what's impersonal. And they're completely different for Isfj, Isfp.
Yeah, that's where you'll find TE sharpness from the FPs. Sometimes FPs will say something regarding their TE and it can actually sound very sharp or blunt. And that's a good example of it. With FE, I find that I never kind of say things in that kind of, okay, so logic is personal to me in the sense that I like to really take my time with understanding something, and I'm very thorough. And I don't know how to explain it. It's so hard to explain. But almost like in contrast with extroverted feeling with FE, you feel a need to gather a consensus of other people's feelings or what they value before saying anything. So FE is way more cognizant of what not to say. So instead of saying what Julien said about the doing it more efficiently, my FE would have went like, don't say that. That's rude. Because I would have gathered a consensus of what people would have felt before opening my mouth. Whereas an ISFP might accidentally say something and it'll become accidentally sharp or accidentally blunt. For two reasons I noticed the most. So one, for Julien's reason, where he said to make things more efficient, they might say something blunt. But also the second reason an ISFP might say something blunt is if their FI is in a bad mood. And they might be a little sharper that day too. And so those are some ways you can kind of tell apart FI and FE. Gets more complicated if the ISFP is an Enneagram type 9. It might be a little less blunt in general because of that too. So mediating factors there.
I was thinking too about the past. Just SI, they seem to really appreciate the past more and use it a lot. Whereas I feel like I remember things, but I don't have the same attachment to the past. And I'm a lot more likely to let things go from the past.
Yeah. With SI, you'll notice more compare and contrast because the sensory is personal to SI users. Sometimes they'll contrast the current sensory situation to a past sensory situation they've gone through. Whereas like ISFPs will do less of a compare and contrast with sensory things that they've gone through apparently. So they're going to be less comparing and contrasting the right now to every other moment they've had that was comparable to that moment. And they're going to more like SE, extroverted sensing, is more going to see things as they are. Like I'm going to see the reality as it actually is because it's impersonal. So you're going to see it more objectively. So you're like, this is actually objective reality around me. Whereas SI is a little more specific with what it remembers from the past or from the sensory because it's more personal. Certain specific things are going to stick out way more to it. It's going to be more attached to those sensory impressions too. Or it's going to be more subjective with the things that it'll take away from something. For instance, There's a certain ICE manager I had before, and he was very specific about the certain TE things he noticed. Like, you could have the floors dirty, but if you cut the onions the right way, he would be totally fine. And it's like, wow, you're so specific with the certain sensory things you want in the certain sensory right way. Whereas if he used SE, he would have noticed that the floors are dirty. Sure, you cut the onions right, but the floor's still dirty. So it'd be more objective. The look at the sensory would be more objective. So that's where I notice SI sticking out. It's so like specific which parts they'll be organized about, and specifically what they don't pay attention to is like so interesting. It's like, wow, you really just did not pay attention to that other thing that was like equally as important. But it's just what the sensory focuses on, I guess. Cool stuff. Anyone else want to add to the ISFJ versus ISFP dialogue?
Yeah, I would add that I feel like ISFJs, they tend to value like procedures and rules a little bit more, especially like socially constructed things, which has to do with FE. But that's just been my experience. I think it's like the SI and the TI together, it just really values like a very clear, concrete understanding of what exactly to do, and like what are the boundaries you want me to operate in, where I think ISFPs are like feel a little bit too constrained the more structure that you add on. So I guess that's another thing for me that I've noticed.
Makes sense, Kurt. All right, on to the last type comparison. ISTP versus ISFP. I'm wondering if someone was wondering if they're lead TI or lead FI, how would you go about differentiating that and why?
I feel like I keep going back to this, but emotions. So like when I took the test at one point, it did split between the IST and the ISF, and it was like 50-50. And so my thought behind that was maybe initially I do lead with emotions or value systems. But then at some point, if somebody keeps doing something, like a pattern I'm catching with my NI, then I TI them or something. Like, I'm like, this doesn't make sense logically to keep going about this interaction. So now I need to change how I'm going about this situation with the person. And so I kind of felt like, I don't think that people who lead with TI would think that way. I feel like they're a lot less likely to be emotionally responsive to other people, if that makes any sense. Yeah, like it just seems to be they're not thinking about emotional responses. And I might also be taking that from other people I've watched you interview that were ISTPs, but that just seems to be a consensus of there is no like striking a chord with them emotionally, or their values are not as stringent, I guess, as it seems to be with FI.
Yeah, I almost see that as a bit of TE, Monique. What you call your TI is really your FI feels something, so your TE wants to do something about it. All right, I feel this. I'm going to change an action to get a more efficient result to align more with my FI. Yeah, that's a really good differentiation, though. I find that with one of the ways you can tell apart these types, the ISTP and the ISFP, is when you create something, do you consider it more a craft or an art? With FI, when it creates something, it's a little more personal because you have the FI imbued into it. And so you might feel like you're expressing a part of you, even if it's not all of you. You're like, maybe nothing can really truly capture the complexity of who you are. But it feels like personal because it might be expressing something that means something to you. And so you might have this emotional attachment to the things that you create in some way. Whereas TI doesn't feel like it's expressing a part of itself when it creates something. It feels more like a craft. It feels more like a competency skill building thing. But there's no identity function sometimes being linked to that art piece like FI would. TI identity is in another area. And so any other differentiations?
Honestly, like I don't really understand TI. I marvel at TI. I want to understand it better, but it's like this depth of logic that goes so many layers that I just can't fathom. It's like for example, taking apart a piece of machinery, and there's all these layers that you have to take off for the machinery to get it down. And I could do that, but it would take me weeks to figure it out, and I would still mess it up putting it back together, because I'm like, I don't really like, why does this fit here or there? Like, I know, like, if it's like blocks, you know, like my logic goes about as far as like the circle block goes in the circle hole, the square block goes in the square hole, you know, and like beyond that, it's like I don't have the nuance that some TI users might have, where they're like really seeing through how something works many layers down. It's kind of like, for me, it's more like caveman style, where it's like, what can we like bang on to make this process finish and work? And then I guess because TE is lower than me, it's even more juvenile. But that's kind of like a differentiating thing that I can't really identify, and I'm sorry that I can't, but it's this depth of logic that I feel, as somebody who has TE, who has FI, just doesn't really have that much access to. And it's something that we can all develop in a way, but it's not natural. My curiosity to understand how something really works many layers down, it doesn't exist. It's like, I want to understand how this produces a result, and how to operate it. And that's the most I'm curious about it. And beyond that, like how it actually works many layers down, don't really care. I'd gladly leave that to someone who has TI.
Yeah. TI might be more fascinated with technicalities and lose the emotional response to it sometimes because of that, actually.
Honestly, gonna kind of tag on to what Julien was saying. Like with the like delving into things, the FI like only cares up to a certain extent, like the kind of result that you want to get, you know what I mean? But past that, like I can totally relate with that. Like I just don't care. I just don't. And then yeah, it's just like up to like a certain extent, like how far your FI wants to take things. But other than that, that's kind of where the curiosity ceases.
I notice with some ISFPs, like sometimes you don't need a justification for what you feel. It's really like you feel like this, so you feel like this. If an ISFP were vegan and someone asked you why you're vegan, some of them might go like, because I feel like I want to be, you know? The feeling in it is its justification in itself sometimes with some things for ISFPs, because it has to do with the FI and the SE. So the FI is like, because I feel this way, and the SE is like, well, it is what it is. I just feel the way that I feel.
I mean, I can kind of relate to that too. Like, um, I mean, almost like religion wise, like I'm not like super religious or anything, but like, I mean, I believe in like a higher power or something, but I'm not like delving into like religion or like religious theory or anything like that. Like I just feel it, so I believe it, so like that's it, you know? Like I don't really think it needs to be like that deep, you know what I mean? But
Makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah. And Kurt, your thoughts on ISTP versus ISFP?
Yeah, I think there's definitely lots of similarities, again, with the perceiving functions being the same and in the same position. So I think for that, you might see some confusion in the type, and then you're leading with a judging function, so that's similar. One big difference I've noticed, because one of my best friends is an ISTP, and it's funny because his fiance is also an ISFP like me, and so we sometimes have just funny conversations about the differences. And one thing that he pointed out was that he feels like he's way more compassionate than either of us is, and I think it's because even with FE in the last position, I feel like it shows up strong for people who are TI DOMs, both INTP and ISTP. For some reason, that FE like can show up a lot when more like as a view of the world and how people are supposed to treat each other. So this example he was sharing was like someone came to his door trying to sell something, I think, and it was like cold and raining out, and he was like So he invited them in and like gave them a beer or something. And it was because in his mind, that was like an act of compassion of someone who's like out in the cold. Whereas I would probably like feel very uncomfortable doing that. And I would also just think like, okay, well, this person is choosing to do this. So I wouldn't necessarily feel like that's a position to have compassion on somebody in. But it made sense to me, like how he would view it that way. So I think it's important to note that like there's a big difference between like emotions, the way we experience them. But I could see how someone might think like that potentially they could be a feeler, because there is still that like compassionate humanity side, even for TI DOMs. But I also think it's like, I also think they don't feel specific emotions as deeply and thoroughly. I also have a sister who's an ISTP, and she was, it's really interesting actually to me because I grew up with my sister, obviously. And when we were kids, like looking back before we had any conversations about Myers-Briggs, I wouldn't have thought she was a thinker type, because I saw her having lots of emotions, you know. But when we were discussing a little bit about the types, she was sharing how like her first boyfriend that she had, he told her at some point that he loved her, and she was just like a deer in headlights. She didn't know how to respond. It was just like, I was like, oh, that's so interesting. So yeah, I feel like I was a little bit scattered what I just said, but I think there's definitely a difference in like how deeply you would feel emotions personally, and there's a difference in like where your emotions are directed. Like, are they directed more at yourself and sort of like identifying what you're feeling and giving like lots of space for people to feel lots of different things, versus having perhaps extroverted feeling, even in that last position, gives you a little bit more of like just a general like compassionate view of the world and how like interpersonal interactions and how people ought to relate, but maybe you don't personally feel things super deeply.
Yeah, well put, Kurt. And so thank you everyone for coming out and sharing your wonderful ISFP perspectives. There is this deep, rich inner emotional material within you all, and I can sense it. And that alignment you have towards that inner you is really respectable. It's this realness, this naturalness, this organicness that y'all have. It's this in tuneness with who you are, and it's admirable. It creates beautiful things in the TE when you guys feel fully FI invested into the TE. And so with Monique, you have like this beautiful eye for style. You just seem very coordinated with your outfit and with all of your aesthetics. So you get that A+ for the aesthetic outlook. And so you do that well. Your SE is well attuned to how things look. And so thank you for making the world a more visually aesthetic place. That is something we need. You take the gray and you turn it into pretty for everyone. So it's great. And so thank you, Julien, for your very wise, sage outlook in things too. You're able to kind of speak on things in a very mature and intellectual way. It's clear that you're very in touch with your NI. And so it's lovely to see that. You can really see the contrast between ISFPs who are a little more NI preferring and ISFPs are a little more SE preferring. Like Monique is more on the SE side, and Kurt and Julien are very much on the more NI side. Adrian, I would say, I'm not sure what side you're on, so I'm not going to comment on that yet. But yeah, there's just that really great, wise outlook you have, Julien. And Adrian, it was really nice to meet you during our typing session together. You have this really chill voice that you talk, and I feel very relaxed. It's that ISFP soothing tone. I don't know, just FI DOMs kind of sometimes talk like they're not in a rush. It's like the opposite of a rushed voice. It's like, yeah, everything's gonna be all right. It's kind of how it feels to listen to some ISFPs. So you have that really nice voice that puts my worriedness at ease.
Are you saying that I have the stoner vibes, Joyce? You don't have to be afraid to say it. I'm just playing.
Yeah, you do.
Funny.
Yeah, I can hear it in Julien's voice a little bit too. Monique has it, but it's not like a stoner voice. It's just a chill voice. And Kurt has like a laughy stoner voice. Like some ISFPs are just very shades of stoner, but like they're not actually stoned. It's just how they talk. It's calming. I'm just saying it's calming, and I equate calming to stoner, but it's not the same thing.
Thank you. That's all I was gonna say.
Cool. And Kurt, it's really nice to be a part of Personality Hackers advanced profiling classes with you. You're really good at self-amusement, and through that you amuse me. And so thank you for that. And so thank you, ISFPs, for coming out. Through your authenticity, you changed the world. Thank you for the beautifulness that you bring into the world, for bringing in these awesome chill vibes, and for bringing in these FI takes on things where you give us a part of who you are and you show it beautifully. And thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you all in the next episode.